Historical materialism is a concept that lies at the heart of Marxist theory. It provides a way of understanding how human societies develop over time, based on material conditions of life, particularly the economy. While many traditional views of history emphasize the role of individuals, ideas, or even chance events, historical materialism argues that the driving force of history is the way humans organize production and labor, what Marx and Engels called the mode of production. But what does that mean in simpler terms? To break it down, the mode of production refers to the way society produces what it needs to survive, things like food, clothing, and shelter. This includes both the forces of production, such as the tools, machines, and technology, and the relations of production, so how people relate to one another within the economy, owners versus workers, for example. Historical materialism suggests that these economic relationships, especially the conflict between those who own the means of production and those who work, are what really shape the political, legal, and social systems around us. As Marx famously said, it is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but their social being that determines their consciousness. So, back to historical materialism. Historical materialism is essentially the Marxist approach to understanding history through the lens of material conditions, meaning the economic activities that sustain life. For Marx and Engels, the structure of society at any given point in history is determined by its economic base or the material base. The material base consists of how things are produced, how labour is organised, and how resources are distributed. The basic idea is that people's everyday work, the tools that they use, and the way they produce and distribute goods shape all other aspects of society. These aspects, political systems, culture, religion, ideas, and even legal institutions, are referred to as the superstructure. According to historical materialism, changes in the material base lead to changes in the superstructure. This is why Marx famously said, "The history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggles." In simpler terms, if you want to understand why a society works the way it does, you should first look at how its economy is structured, how people make a living, and how wealth is distributed. Those economic factors shape everything else. A key component of historical materialism is class struggle. Marx argued that history is essentially a series of struggles between different social classes. In every society, there have been groups that control the means of production, so the tools, the resources, and the factories needed to produce goods, and the groups that don't. The class that owns the means of production has the power to control and exploit whichever class works for them, i.e. the working class. For example, during feudalism, landowners, which were the ruling class, owned the land, and the peasants, the working class, worked the land. As society moved to capitalism, the new ruling class was the bourgeoisie, so the capitalists who then owned the factories and businesses, while the working class became the proletariat, those who sell their labour to survive. In Marx's view, these struggles are not random or coincidental. They are rooted in the way society produces and organises economic life. The conflict between different classes is the motor that drives history forward. For instance, the transition from feudalism to capitalism was not just a political revolution, but also an economic one. The old system of land ownership and serfdom was replaced by industrial production and wage labour. This transition did not just happen overnight. It was driven by the rise of new technologies, the expansion of markets, and the growing power of the bourgeoisie. Marx and Engels argued that human societies have progressed through a series of economic stages, each with its own mode of production and its own class structure. These stages are, number one, primitive communism, so early human societies where resources were shared communally and there was no private ownership of land or of tools. 2 was slavery. As societies developed, they were organised around the exploitation of slaves. The ruling class owned both the land and the people who worked on it. 3 was feudalism, or any general system based on agriculture, where lords owned the land and peasants worked it in exchange for protection and a place to live. Stage 4 is capitalism, which is the current stage, where the means of production are owned by capitalists and workers sell their labour in exchange for wages. The key feature of capitalism is the exploitation of the working class through the extraction of surplus value, so the difference between what workers produce and what they're paid, what capitalists call profit. And 5, socialism, and eventually communism. Marx believed that capitalism would inevitably give way to socialism, a system where the working class seizes control of the means of production, and production is based on meeting human needs rather than generating profit. This, in turn, would lead to a classless, stateless society, being communism. Each stage of history is marked by the class struggle that eventually leads it to collapse and replacement by the next economic system. For example, the struggle between the bourgeoisie and the feudal lords led to the fall of feudalism and the rise of capitalism. Similarly, Marx predicted that the class struggle between the bourgeoisie and proletariat would lead to the end of capitalism and the beginning of socialism. Another key concept within historical materialism is the relationship between the base and the superstructure. The base refers to the economic foundation of society, so the mode of production, the relations of production, and the forces of production that we outlined at the beginning. The superstructure includes all of the cultural, ideological, and political institutions that emerge from and support the economic base. Things like religion, laws, education, and the government. According to Marx, the superstructure exists to protect and perpetuate the base. For example, under capitalism, the legal system protects private property rights, which are essential for maintaining the capitalist mode of production. Similarly, the education system prepares future workers to enter the labour force, by promoting the idea that hard work and obedience will be rewarded. However, the relationship between the base and the superstructure is not static. When the economic base changes, the superstructure must also change. This is why major economic shifts, like the transition from feudalism to capitalism, are often accompanied by significant political and cultural changes. Friedrich Engels, Marx's collaborator, played a significant role in developing the concept of historical materialism. In his work, Anti-Dühring, Engels elaborates on how economic forces shape history and explains that material conditions create the foundation for political and ideological changes. Later Marxists, like Vladimir Lenin, expanded on historical materialism in the context of imperialism. In imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, Lenin applied historical materialism to explain how advanced capitalism leads to the exploitation of weaker nations, and how this drives global conflict and revolution. Rosa Luxemburg, in The Accumulation of Capital, built on historical materialism by showing how the capitalist need for constant expansion drives both colonialism and global economic crisis. She highlighted how the contradictions within capitalism, such as overproduction and the need for new markets, create the conditions for revolutionary change. Historical materialism provides a scientific and materialist approach to understanding history, focusing on how the economic structure of society drives change. Rather than seeing history as a result of individual actions or abstract ideas, Marxists argue that it is the material conditions, particularly the way we produce and distribute goods, that shape society and drive historical progress. From the class struggles of ancient societies to the development of modern capitalism, historical materialism shows how economic forces shape the world that we live in. Marxist thinkers, from Marx and Engels to Lenin and Luxemburg, have used historical materialism to explain how societies change, how class struggle leads to revolution, and how capitalism itself creates the conditions for its own downfall. Understanding this approach to history helps us see the world not as static, unchangeable, but as one shaped by the ongoing struggle between the economic classes. This understanding is key to envisioning and building a future based on equality and justice. We've been the Left Library, and this has been Political Theory Simplified. Thank you.